All right, welcome back to my channel. In this video, we're going to be talking about the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets. Last year was not a good year for Georgia Tech fans, but it's kind of common occurrence for Georgia Tech to have a bad year. 2022 was the last year that they had Jeff Collins as their head coach. Uh, Jeff Collins was faced with a tough task, and that was trying to rebuild not just the Georgia Tech football team, but really the culture of the Georgia Tech program. Because when he was hired, they had a extremely long tenure under Paul Johnson, which they were running triple option offenses. So not only are you changing your offense and defense philosophies, but you're changing the way you're recruiting. You're changing the way you are trying to install the culture in your program. You're trying to breathe some fresh air into Georgia Tech. And a lot of college football pundits, especially the insiders that cover Georgia Tech, said that the 2020 COVID pandemic year really hurt Jeff Collins' ability to install what he wanted to install into the team. Now, I don't believe that's necessarily without merit because a lot of teams suffered from not having a full regular season because of the COVID pandemic. You know, the Pac-12 had a shortened season, the Big Ten had a shortened season as well. But at the end of the day, things could not uh, go well for Jeff Collins at Georgia Tech, and last year was his final year there. He gets blown out by Clemson on opening day. Not really surprising. Clemson has been a great program for a long time, so there's not really too much shame in that. Uh, then he wins against the West Carolina Catamounts. Then he gets absolutely shut out. They get Georgia Tech, excuse me, not just Jeff Collins. The entire team gets shut out by the Ole Miss Rebels, 42-0. And then the very next week they get dominated by UCF, and that was the coup de grace, so to speak, on Jeff Collins' tenure in Atlanta. I mean, it's one thing to get blown out by Power Five schools, but to get dominated by a Group of Five school in UCF, like that just shows that even the Group of Five school is more talented than you, albeit they also have a more experienced head coach in Gus Malzahn. It was still a bad look for the Yellow Jackets, and the institution needed to make a change. But quite frankly, the change, in my opinion, should have been made way before Jeff Collins, and that was moving on from Paul Johnson and transitioning the program into uh, being more into what modern college football teams are supposed to look like now. So I felt that the change of the culture was long overdue, way before Jeff Collins was hired and way before he was fired, certainly. Uh, but things started to take a turn for the better if you're a Georgia Tech fan. They hired, at the time, interim coach Brent Key. And in his very first game as the interim coach, they beat the Pitt Panthers, who won the ACC the previous year. They beat them on the road, who had Keaton Slovis and Jared Rain, and a very nice running back who got drafted by the Jets in the fifth round earlier this past draft. I can't remember his name. And then the very next week they beat another team who had another good year. That was the Duke Blue Devils. The Duke Blue Devils was 9-4 in their first season under Mike Elko, who used to be the defense coordinator for Texas A&M Aggies under Jimbo Fisher. Uh, I thought Mike Elko had the second best year one of any head coach in the Power Five outside of obviously Sonny Dykes and TCU. The Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets beat them, went 23-20 in overtime. I thought it was a very nice couple of wins for them heading into the bye week, and Georgia Tech went from a 1-3 team to a 3-3 team heading into their bye week, and it looked like they may had a chance to play for a bowl game, especially when you look at some of the teams that they faced later on. After the bowl week, after their bye week, excuse me, they played the Virginia Cavaliers. Virginia was 3-7, not a good team. They also dealt with a big tragedy in which some of their football players and former alumni had their lives taken away in a horrific shooting rampage. So I'm not going to rip Virginia too much. Then the very next week they get blown out by Florida State. Florida State had a 10-3 season, much improvement over their third year compared to the first 2 years under Mike Norvell. So not really disappointment for Georgia Tech to get blown up by Florida State. They were a very good team last. They were a good team last year. So I don't think Georgia Tech fans should have been too disappointed in that. I mean, never fun to see your team get blown out, but knowing the circumstances, you shouldn't have been. This one they should have taken this one real well. Virginia Tech, the very next week, it was a 1 point game on the road. Blacksburg is still one of the toughest college football venues to play at if you're an opponent. But they have one of the most well-known pregame traditions and entrances for a home team in college football. Virginia Tech playing the Sandman. It's always fun to watch on television. I always wondered what it would be like to experience it in person. But Georgia Tech went on the road and beat the Hokies. Next week they get blown out by the Miami Hurricanes. Uh, the it's Mario Cristobal's first year in Miami, as I covered in my Miami video. It did not go well at all. But they were able to secure a victory against Georgia Tech and not only secure the victory but blow them out as well. The very next week, they beat North Carolina on the road. Another road victory, another impressive victory for Brent Key, and that will be his fourth ACC win. As bad as Georgia Tech was last year, the one thing that they can say is that they had more ACC wins than the Miami Hurricanes. The Miami Hurricanes and the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets were both 5-7, but Georgia Tech had more ACC wins, and they literally changed coaches in the middle of the year, as opposed to Miami, who supposedly had put together this great coaching staff. And here they are a year later, and both coordinators are gone. So much for Miami putting together a great staff. And then the very next week they get blown out by Georgia. But I saw this game. Georgia Tech was actually kind of competitive with Georgia in the first half of the game, which I know is kind of sounds like loser talk to say. It sounds like loser talk to say, well, we were competitive, but if you had seen Georgia versus Georgia Tech the last few years, Georgia Tech just absolutely would blow out Georgia way worse than what this score was. This score was only a 23-point margin. Georgia would blow out Georgia Tech by 30 to 40 points on the regular the previous few years before this game. So for Georgia Tech fans, the fact that you were even competitive with Georgia, to them, even though it's a loss, you'll still happy with the fact that how much better uh, competitive that matchup was. But at the end of the day, a loss is a loss. They were 5-7, and they missed out on a bowl game yet again. So here it is, a new season and their first full season under their head coach Brent Key. They're going to be in a neutral site game at the Falcons Stadium in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, me personally, I think it's ridiculous that the NCAA would put Georgia Tech at the Falcons Stadium in Atlanta when the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets already have their own stadium. It's not like the Hurricanes or the South Florida Bulls or the Pitt Panthers where they're literally sharing teams with NFL organizations. Pitt sharing with the Steelers, South Florida sharing with the Buccaneers, Hurricanes sharing with the Dolphins. It's not like that. Georgia Tech already has their own stadium, so why not just play the game there? But anyway, they still have it in the Falcons Stadium on ESPN. It's going to be on a Friday night. Um, Louisville is heading into their year one with their coach as well, just like Georgia Tech. Excuse me, sorry about that. Uh, Louisville just hired Jeff Brom, and I saw in my Miami video I mispronounced his name. I thought it was Jeff Boredom. It's Jeff Brom, so I apologize for mispronouncing his name. Jeff Brom, who was the Purdue coach who helped them win the Big Ten West, and for Purdue, that's absolutely phenomenal for them to win their to win the Big Ten West Division title and compete against Michigan for the Big Ten championship. Despite that, I think Louisville will beat Georgia Tech. I think Jeff Brom has shown that he can get the most out of his players, being in Purdue, going up against the tough competition that he was going up against in the Big Ten. I see Louisville winning that game. Then the very next week, Georgia Tech will have their home opener against South Carolina State Bulldogs. Uh, FCS matchup, but I think Georgia Tech should be able to get this victory right here. I think it should be a nice victory for them. Then the very next week they're on the road at Ole Miss. I don't see them beating Ole Miss at all. Lane Kiffin's one of the best offensive minds in college football. I think he's a great coordinator. I'm not so sure about him as a head coach because as a Power Five head coach, he has yet to win anything. He quit Tennessee after year one. He got fired from USC, didn't win anything substantial there. And Ole Miss, he still has yet to win anything in Oxford, and this is going to be his fourth year there. He was hired there in 2020, then he was there 2021, 2022, and now he's going to be here 2023. 4 years, and he doesn't get a substantial win. Ole Miss, uh, Ole Miss fans need to be thinking, you know what, is this guy really capable of helping us get over the hump and compete for SEC titles? I think if he doesn't have a substantial win this year, they need to start questioning that. The very next week, they're on the road. Georgia Tech is on the road again at Wake Forest. I think Wake Forest will beat Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech comes back home against the Bowling Green Falcons. I think they could beat the Falcons, and then they're on the road at Miami. And if you saw my Miami video, I had Miami going 8-4 because I don't think Amari Cristobal team is going to have back-to-back uh, record losing not only back-to-back losing records but back-to-back years of not missing a bowl game, especially with all the talent that they brought in this year through recruiting in the transfer pool. And I see Miami having a win here. Then they get a bye week, and then their very next game is against Boston College. Boston College, I'm not a fan of their head coach Jeff Hafley. They were 3-9 last year. They were 6-6 the year before. But if you look at their 6 victories, none of them came against a team with a winning record in FBS. Uh, their victory came against Missouri, who was 6-7 that year. They also beat Temple, who was 3-9. They beat Georgia Tech, who was 3-9, and then they also beat UMass or Massachusetts in full term, who was 1-11. I mean, that was the same record as Arizona that year, and the same records as Colorado Northwestern in 2022. So it just was not uh, just no real good impressive victory for Boston College in 2021, and the very next year they lose to Rutgers, and who was 4-8, and they were just 3-9. They were just god awful. I actually think Georgia Tech can beat Boston College. I'm just not a fan of their coach. I don't think that program is going anywhere underneath that guy. Not that they should expect anything more than 6 to 8 wins a year, but I just don't think I don't think he's a good coach, and I think Georgia Tech can beat the Eagles in this game. They're going to be at home again against the North Carolina Tar Heels. Tar Heels are kind of intriguing. They brought in Mac Brown, who used to coach them I believe in the '90s, and then went on to Texas and won a national championship in Austin. They brought him back. It seemed like they were starting to take that step forward in 2020. They made an Orange Bowl appearance, but it seems like ever since then they've been kind of slowly but surely deteriorating under Mac Brown, and now it feels like they're kind of been a stagnant program. They're bringing back Drake May, who's one of the best quarterbacks in the ACC, and they're bringing back their defense coordinator Gene Chizik. I'm not really sure if that's gonna um, be a sign for much improvement if you're bringing back the same players and the same coaches from the previous year when you were expected to be better and you weren't. I think North Carolina, but I do think North Carolina can go on the road and beat Georgia Tech, and I think they will. Then they're going to be on the road at Virginia. Virginia, like I said, um, not going to rip them too much because of what they're dealing with off the field. But I think Georgia Tech can beat Virginia on the road. Virginia was not a good team last year. I mean, the Hurricanes, think about this. The Hurricanes went into Virginia, didn't score a touchdown for fourth quarter, a full game of regulation and 4 overtimes, and still beat Virginia on Virginia's home turf. Virginia's just not a good program right now. I know fans were tired of Bronco Mendenhall, but I'm not really sure if their current head coach is giving them reasons to think that he'll be much better. So I have Georgia Tech winning against Virginia. Georgia Tech goes on the road against Clemson the very next week. I don't see Georgia Tech beating Clemson. I'm not even going to really give too much of a reasoning for why I think Clemson's going to beat Georgia Tech. I think it's just kind of obvious, and as the saying goes, what's understood doesn't really need to be said. I'm not going to draw out some long analysis about about why Clemson is just better than Georgia Tech. If you know, you know. Uh, the very next week they come back home. And then their final two games, excuse me, are at home against Syracuse and Georgia. I think they can beat Syracuse. I don't think Syracuse is really going to be is really an improving program under Dino Babers. I think they can beat Georgia Tech can beat Syracuse, and then they're going to be at home against Georgia. I'm going to give you the same explanation like I did with Clemson. What's understood doesn't need to be said. Do we really need to go into a 5 minute diatribe about why Georgia is going to beat Georgia Tech? I think it's kind of obvious why. Um, Kirby Smart, like I said in my video. I think it was my Auburn video. I said Kirby Smart has Georgia where Alabama was in the early 2010s, where it seemed like you almost kind of fear the team when you see them on their schedule. And right now they're the best program in the nation. They've won back-to-back national titles. They've had elite recruiting classes since Kirby Smart has been in Athens, and they've been an NFL pipeline for the last 2 years, and I just can't think of a reason why Georgia Tech would beat Georgia. I think it's even silly to even make that argument. So that is my record prediction for the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets. Lose to Louisville, lose to Ole Miss, lose to Wake Forest, lose to Miami, lose to North Carolina, lose to Clemson, and lose to Georgia. So 5-7 record. Uh, Sorry, Georgia Tech fans, but your program has just not been a good program for a long time. And quite frankly, they waited too long to make a change culturally for their football program, way before Jeff Collins was even hired. So I'm not really sure most of the head coaches would have done much better than Jeff Collins in his first 4 years at Georgia Tech, being that they kept the triple offense for so long, and to expect a night and day difference in the teams within a couple of years, I think is just foolish if you're a Georgia Tech fan. So that's my record prediction for them: 5-7. Um, if there was a game where they could possibly flip and maybe get a victory, I would probably say if I had to pick one, it would probably be Louisville. Other than that, or maybe Wake Forest because Sam Hartman transferred from Wake Forest to Notre Dame. So the fact that they're not going to have one of the best quarterbacks in the ACC last year, Wake Forest, that is, being that they're not going to have Sam Hartman back, maybe that could be a reason why I could say you could beat Wake Forest. But other than that, I can't really think of any reasoning. That's my record for them, 5-7.